Welcome to the first episode of the Climbing Lifer podcast. And I'm Don McGrath, I'm your host. And I created the Climbing Lifer podcast for climbers who want to figure out how to stay at it for a long time. You know, for most of us, I'm 56 now, and it's less about the super hard send than it is about really making an integral part of my life and figure out how I can do it as long as I possibly can, because I'm very passionate about it. So every week I will be interviewing someone who has successfully navigated being a climbing lifer. And so I hope you get, some tips and some secrets out of here from my guests. And I am just so excited for this first episode to have Ajax Greene on the show. And so Ajax and I reconnected. I think we actually met quite a number of years ago up in the Adirondacks at Poco Moonshine or Spider's Web or something like that. Yeah. A friend of ours, Rui. But we reconnected because I was climbing in the Gunks for about a month and climbed with my friend Rui, who lives here in Boulder. And Ajax and Rui are great friends. So I had the opportunity to climb with Ajax. But, it really wasn't until after we spent that day together that Rui was telling me what Ajax had done in his past. And I was just totally blown away. And so when I was looking at guests that are climbers, lifers that have climbed, for Ajax in his case, he's been climbing more than 50 years. What better example of someone to share what it's been to start early, go through and have climbed with just a huge cast of characters that were influential, along with Ajax himself, in the American climbing scene, even the world climbing scene. And so I'm just so excited to have you on this first podcast. Ajax Greene, welcome to the podcast.
Well, it's great to be here, Don. I know we had fun that day we were out, so we're off to a good start.
I mean, can it get any better in the fall in the Gunks climbing classics like Ken's Crack and Son of EZO? It just can't get any better than that. And we had a blast. So, I'm so happy to have you on the show, and I'm honored. And I would love you to share how you get started. I mean, I always find people's stories about how they got started in climbing fascinating.
How I got started actually starts before me. It starts with my dad, who had been a hiker and skier during the 1930s. In 1939, when Tony Matt shushed the head wall on Tuckerman's in the Inferno race, that is really a famous thing. My dad was one of the gatekeepers that day. And then he went on to be in the 10th Mountain Division, which, gained a lot of notoriety during the Second World War. That's really where the entire American ski industry came out of, the 10th. Now, my dad was not one of the famous folks, but yet he was very much part of it. And, I grew up with all the tall tales of, what went on with the 10th. So I started hiking with my dad when I was 5. Started skiing when I was 6. When I was 9, I was the youngest person at that time to have done all the 4,000-foot mountains in New Hampshire. At 10, I was the youngest at that time to do all the 4,000-foot mountains in New England. And so the following year, it was like, well, what's the next challenge? I was sort of pretty goal-oriented. And I think my father, in hindsight, was very strategic, and he knew he could see I was on a trajectory, and it was all coming from me. This was not someone, he was excited by it, but yet not pushing any of this on me. But he had given me a copy that winter from 10 to 11 of John the biography of John Harlan called Straight Up. And I just got completely addicted to, climbing literature of that time, a lot very focused on the Eiger, which still holds a special place in my mind from all of that early reading. So I say I started climbing at age 11, although that's when I started rock climbing. I'd actually had a rope on 2 years before that at 9 and 10, but on snow on Mount Washington. So I started with the Appalachian Mountain Club. They had a beginners program in the Boston area. And my dad, who was like 59 when I started with me. And then he learned just enough, about belaying and climbing and so forth, so that I wouldn't kill myself. But he kind of bowed out. But we still, he all the way, to the end of his life, we went away pretty much every weekend together and climbed. So,
that's very, very fascinating. There's a couple things in there that really fascinate me. First of all, your father was kind of a climbing lifer, right?
Yeah.
In maybe a different way, his love of the mountains, whether it be in skiing, and that kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of infected you with that. And
Absolutely.
another thing is, you were talking that reminded me of something that's fascinating. You said your dad was not one of the stars, but was influential. And, I think you would probably consider yourself that same way, maybe in the climbing realm. I remember listening to a podcast of you on Climb Talk, and that's very much what you said. You said you were kind of fly under the radar. Like, a lot of people may not have heard of Ajax Greene, but you were very influential in climbing. So I find that fascinating, the relationship with you and your father.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I'm actually thrilled you brought that up. I've never thought about it in that way. And I've thought a lot about my dad because we were extraordinarily close. So that's a really interesting new thing you've brought up. But in terms of my own climbing, yeah, I would always have described myself as sort of a B team climber. My best friends were all the A team, but there was just something about them. There were days I could climb as hard as any of them, but they put together more comprehensive climbing careers than I did. And some of that, and maybe we'll get into it, is, my interest in having a more diverse life than just climbing, led me adrift maybe earlier than some of them, and they went on and kept having, ongoing climbing successes.
Yeah, and for those who aren't familiar with what you've done, you hung with a quite impressive cast of characters, including Henry Barber, Earl Wiggins, David Brashears, Pat Ement. I mean, this was Jim Erickson, right? See, these were some people who were definitely and you were in their circle. You had some amazing adventures with them, and you, through their influence, I'd imagine you ended up going on to devote your early life to rock climbing, right?
Oh yeah, I graduated. Basically, I hated being in school, and when I was in high school, I really just wanted to climb, and so. I took I grew up in the Boston area. I took my first trip out west to Boulder in 1972 when I was 15. It just blew my mind. And after that, I wanted to have nothing to do with school. And so, we used to climb before school, after school. That's if I went to school, because the 2 years I was in high school, I just skipped dozens and dozens of days to go climbing. I figured out that just sort of randomly, I was able to work it out that I could graduate a year early. So I had just turned 17, like a few weeks before I graduated. And I left almost immediately with Henry and Rick Hatch, and actually Henry's girlfriend at the time, to head out west. And then I spent, the next about 8 years on the road climbing full time.
Yeah, that's amazing to have that opportunity. And I think you've had some incredible adventures. I'm sure you were influenced heavily by that circle of climbers in that area. Is there one particular story that you have there that would really highlight that time of your life?
Wow. That's a tough one, because there are just dozens of stories and people. The one thing I know, we had talked about climbing mentors. And even though Henry was only 4 years older than I am, we neither of us remember meeting. We'd actually met hiking before either of us were climbers. And we only know that because our parents remember meeting each other, kind of thing. And so I would say Henry, was during that decade of the 70s, was one of my best friends. We were pretty close. And I would say he was, very much one of my climbing, mentors. I think on some level, our styles were somewhat similar. We weren't project people. It's like, go in and flash it or do it in a couple of tries and then just move on, and sort of his heady style of climbing, scary stuff, free soloing, that all, certainly leaked into my life. And, I recently had someone friend me on Facebook that I haven't seen from Yosemite since the 70s. And their opening comment after I friended them was, "We're so glad to see you alive."
Yeah, and you had shared on a previous interview that I was just watching yesterday that some of that like became kind of spiritual to you, that you found some sort, it sent you a bit on a spiritual journey in your life. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. I've always viewed climbing, even though we'll say in my teens and 20s, I might not have had the maturity to express it this way. But I think for me, climbing has always been more about being a human being than trying to be the highest number I could, click. And that it was the expression of climbing. It was that attempt to perform, to climb hard. The goal wasn't just to, to click that number. It was, who do I need to become as a human being to do that? And until this day, I mean, I can be terribly uninterested in people who, it's all about their ego and all about, how cool they think they are. And I'm much more like, talk to me about who you are as a human being, what are you doing to save humanity, save the world, and be part of that. And that's far more interesting to me. And I think that and climbing hard can be very intricately linked in a really interesting way.
Yeah. And so that's really interesting. I absolutely love that. And I think that's how we have probably managed to stay climbing for so long. Because if it is about the numbers, you get really frustrated and quit. I was a runner, and I found myself as I hit 30 years old training just as hard, if not harder, and running slower. So that's not really a sustainable model, right? But so you climbed full time. And you experienced these incredible things with some great mentors. And then you told me that you kind of got burnt out a little bit. And so you decided to step back a little bit. I'd love to hear more about kind of what was going on and what happened.
Well, two things happened. First, I was having some minor injuries, but I realized that just, climbing 250 or 300 days a year, even in your 20s, was hard on your body. So I took 2 winters off to go ski racing, and I was still climbing the rest of the year hard. But that was an attempt to sort of diversify my cross training, would be a more modern term, so that, I never became a great ski racer whatsoever. Anyone who out there is a ski racer, I was not a good one. It did make me an outstanding recreational skier. Like I could go to any hill in the country and ski as well as most of the people there. So it was great. I liked it. And then that just led into, in the 80s, I think I kind of went through a brief unauthentic yuppie phase when I climbed every year, but I was climbing a lot less during the 80s. And then part of that, I was married at the time. My wife climbed a little bit, but I would not describe her as a climber. And she didn't prevent me per se, but I chose. And part of that, I was even living in Eldo and not climbing much. So it was kind of an odd time. I was skiing a lot, so still super active. But then in the late 80s, I kind of reawoken and said, you know, I've let a really important part of myself not be in the forefront as much as it had been, and I need to bring it back. And that's when I sort of, I think, figured out my plan, you know, maybe not consciously, but, you know, over time for the rest of my life. You know?
I love it, Ajax. I'm becoming a climbing lifer. So you are listening to an interview with Ajax Greene, a legend and real influencer in American climbing. And you are listening to the Climbing Lifer podcast. I'd like to give a shout out to one of our sponsors, Sharp End Publishing. They are a climbing publishing company by climbers for climbers. And so they publish all kinds of guidebooks. You know, their Shelf Road guidebook is my favorite, my go-to. That's one of my crags. You know, they have great guidebook on Indian Creek, Moab, New York City bouldering. Just go to sharpendbooks.com and you can see all their offerings. So if you know you have an upcoming trip, go there and see what they have. If you don't have an upcoming trip, go there and get inspired to create an upcoming trip. And I can't say enough about Fred and Heidi Knapp and what they've done for me personally. They are publishers of my book that I published with Jeff Ellison, that I wrote with Jeff Ellison, Vertical Mind, which is about psychological approaches to optimal climbing. And so we received great feedback on this book. And if you want to get this book, you can go to sharpendbooks.com or Amazon. Pick it up if you want to improve your mental game. So Ajax, so you kind of went through this period where you kind of drifted. It sounds like you were still climbing a little bit, like you said, I was climbing, but I wasn't really a climber maybe in that period. So tell me about that transition and what was going on, and how did you come to the realization? What was the moment when you recognized, gosh, I need to revitalize this climbing thing?
It's interesting. Probably the oldest friend I'm still in contact with, my friend Steve Hendrick, who I climbed a lot with in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I think he and I went climbing up on Cannon. You know, I hadn't been climbing much. And I was just like, I was single again. I had the freedom, and I was just like, wow, this is really fun. Why aren't I doing this all the time? And that really brought me back in a, serious and consistent way.
Yeah, sometimes life circumstances just changes the things for us, right? I mean, there could be an illness, there could be a relationship, there could be a move, there could be career, there could be job. And, I think a lesson that I think I've learned, and it sounds like you've experienced too, is just being flexible, just adapting to whatever that situation is. Would that describe the philosophy or the strategy?
Yeah, there is no question there's a rhythm to life. And so some years you climb a lot and you have a really good year. Some years you don't. And I mean, for me, I've really worked on not being attached to the outcome, just showing up on any given day, do my best, whatever that is. That might be not very hard. That might be pretty hard, doesn't matter as long as I just show up and do my best with no attachment. And as long as I'm having fun, it don't matter.
That's incredible. A little earlier, you mentioned that you had some minor injuries, and climbing, no doubt, is hard on our bodies. I had shoulder surgery a few years ago. it can be tough. And when I was asking people about what they might want to get from this podcast, one of the things was, dealing with injuries, whether from a mental aspect or from a physical aspect. So maybe you can share with us what lessons have you learned about staying away from them, or when you get them, how do you handle that?
The first thing, and I think I might have said something earlier, I really, I can't say exactly when I got to this. Maybe it might have been because it was, I had been living out in Colorado, but again, not climbing much. And I moved back east. I remember thinking, oh, if I'm going to live here in the East, I have to think of activities to do on rainy days because you get them here. And so that's when I took up mountain biking because, you can do that on maybe not in the pouring rain, you can, but not so much fun. But, crummy days when you definitely don't want to be climbing, you can be outdoors mountain biking. And so I think that kind of got me morphed into this idea of cross training. And so that I can always be active, but I spread it out over a number of different activities. And I find when I get injured, it's because I've done the same activity too much. And I'm tired, and that's when I get injured. But what I've discovered is, and this comes back to the ego thing, because of my cross training, I can't climb as hard by doing that as if I just focused on climbing. But my fear is if I just focus on climbing and climbing harder and I get injured, then I'm out, and that's a problem. And so I would, and let me, and these are made up numbers, but maybe if I focused only on climbing, I'd still be climbing 5'11". Well, but if I got injured and I'm out, well, that's awful. I'd rather be content climbing 5'9". I'm still leading solid gunks 5'9". And I hike, I bike a lot. I'm a road biker now. I gave up the mountain biking. And I do lots of other activities that I enjoy them just as much as climbing. And I feel like that cross training is like I'm exercising all the time. Now, this is a particularly good year. Not every year is like this, but I track, and I'm not a spreadsheet guy, but I just track the number of days in a month I exercise and what it was. Nothing more than that, not even in a spreadsheet. But, this year I'll come close. I'll be just under averaging 23 days a month of exercise. But that's spread out over lots of different things. And so for me, I'm healthy and I'm happy. That's like the starting point. That's what matters. And then the numbers, hey, if they come, great. If they don't, who cares? I'm never going to do what I've done before. So why get attached to any of it as long as I'm having fun? For me now, like going out that day with you and Rui, I love you guys. I did climbs I've done a million times. I could care less if I did those climbs. But for me, the joy was climbing with you guys. I like climbing. I like the exercise. But it was being with you that was the magic, So
that is something that I've grown to appreciate. When I was younger, I was like, get after it. My wife used to make fun of me because I'd be up pacing around the tent at 6 o'clock in the morning, like, let's get going, right? And so climbing for me also is about the company. It's about where I go to eat. It's like some cool stuff to do around, like you had mentioned before, like if you're thinking about going on a climbing trip, it's about the climbing, but it's also about other cool places that it will bring you and other experiences that you'll have, right? So this whole concept of diversity, I think, is really emerging out of our conversation. Diversity in training, diversity in experience, diversity. So yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
diversity in people.
I couldn't agree more. So
Now, one thing I could tell by watching you climb, because we climbed Son of Ezio, and we're party of three. So what do you do when you're not belaying or climbing? You watch, and your technique is phenomenal. I mean, your footwork is phenomenal, and I think that's something that as we get more trips around the sun, it's a great opportunity for us, right? Because we can no longer depend upon maybe some of the tools that we used to really depend upon. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for those of us who really want to focus on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. People always talk about my footwork, and it's true. It was always a strength that isn't there anymore, but was when I was younger. Was my flexibility. I could do a Russian split and put my chest to the floor, no problem. And now, it's like if I can bend over and touch my knees, it's a good morning. But yeah, I think those things are important. I mean, for me, and it's the same thing with skiing as with climbing. It's like with skiing, it's not how fast I go, it's do I feel the flow of the curve as I'm going through my turn. Same thing with climbing. It's like, can I get myself in the flow? And it doesn't, sometimes that does happen on really hard climbs, but sometimes that can happen amazingly on more moderate climbs where it's just, you feel this flow. And that flow, I'm really, I'm a longtime meditator and mindfulness person. And that's when you're in that flow state, that's when sports can participate in restructuring our brains and making them more holistic and more effective. So there's actually a lot of science behind this fun.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. It's interesting you say that because in my first book, 50 Athletes Over 50, I interviewed 50 athletes doing all kinds of different sports. And one of the lessons that emerged from me and out of that research was that one of the most common reasons that they're still at it is the joy of play. They've been able to tap into that part of the brain that gets stimulated by play. And a lot of us kind of forget what it's like to play, and when we play, it taps into incredible creative juices. And, so I think there is this element of being able to really tap into our love for that feel of what it's like to just play and move.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The words you used were perfect, but it is magical when you're out and you're just flowing. And that's it's not the numbers that I find addictive. It's that feeling of flow. And I can get that on 5'2", or I can get that on 5'11". It doesn't matter. And that's what's interesting, and I think when you let go of that attachment of some kind of defined thing, because like lots of times I'll go climbing and there are days you have a great day, and then there's days you go out and you just go, and I learned this back when I was soloing in the old days. I'd walk up, I'd start up 20 feet and I'd go, not today. Because I learned to really listen really deep inside what was really going on. And I still bring that to my climbing today, whether it's top roping, leading, doesn't matter. There are some days like I won't lead. There's other days I won't even climb. I just, belay or kibitz with my friends. And then I'll just leave early because I'm just not having a good day. And it's not, I might be in a perfectly good mood. I'm just not in the flow climbing. So why fight it? Just go with it.
And that can be really tricky, right? That takes a whole different level of attunement because, we always, I don't know about you, but I think most people, because, I do workshops on this kind of stuff. Most of us at some level have a little bit of butterflies or a little bit of something before we climb. And it kind of doesn't matter on the grade unless it's super easy. And there's something inside our head that sometimes we like, I don't know if I'm up for this. Maybe that burrito I had for breakfast is maybe I'm not doing my best. And so, one of our challenges is to overcome that But one of our other challenges is to be really in tune enough to know when to honor that.
Right. No, the butterflies, no, I get those exactly as you described. Doesn't matter the grade. I'm like, oh, don't want to do anything dumb on this.
Right.
And so I completely appreciate the butterfly thing, but that's different. That's like a performance anxiety, and you're right. We need to work through that. But this is a little bit deeper than that. It's like, like I said, some days things click, some days they don't. I like the word flow. Some days you're just really out of the flow. And at that point, it's just like, why fight it? You're not going to change it. The universe, there's things that, and I think this is something I say frequently. Sometimes in life, there's things we're supposed to make happen. Sometimes in life, there's things we're supposed to let happen. And wisdom is knowing the difference between the two. And so sometimes climbing is not about trying, it's about letting it happen, letting that inner flow come out and just going up. And it's not about just getting your gur on. And sometimes it is. And, it really, it's a lifelong inner conversation that I think humanity should be having, because if we're having that on the rocks, then we're having that conversation, then we're having that in our lives. And I think that makes us better human beings.
Well, if you're listening to this or watching this, I hope you had your pen and paper out. That was incredible wisdom. And I want to hear more about that, because I want to hear about how those things have translated to non-climbing things in your life, Ajax. But I do want to give a shout out to another one of our sponsors, Speakers Pathway Coalition. I'm co-founder of Speakers Pathway Coalition. We show people who use their expertise in this how to monetize their message, whether it be writing their book, whether it be putting together talks, getting paid for speaking, developing workshops. That's what we do. If you want to learn more about that, you can look us up on the interweb. It's speakerspathway.com. You can find out all about us, but I'm just honored to be part of Speakers Pathway and to help people to monetize their message. So I want to do, you ready for a little fun game, Ajax?
Sure, of course.
I want to do this fun game. I'm going to play around a little bit. This is kind of like a speed dating thing. I want to call it like get to know Ajax and quick. All right. Okay. So I've got a number of things I'm going to fire at you and just answer the questions. They're simple. I mean, I'm not going to ask you a math question or anything, but these are more about you. And this is for people listening to get to know Ajax really fast. So here, are you ready?
Yep.
All right. Favorite food?
Mushrooms.
Mushrooms. Any particular kind of mushrooms? Or you're just a mushroom lover?
Mushroom lover, although one of my dear friends here, I'm not into it, but I go with her and I hold her dogs while she forages for wild mushrooms. So I eat a lot of wild mushrooms and, that are locally foraged. So that's terrific.
All right. So trad climbing, sport climbing, or bouldering?
Absolutely trad climbing.
Favorite beverage?
Green tea.
Green tea.
Right here.
Favorite book? Favorite book?
Favorite book? Oh boy. Since we mentioned it earlier, I'll just say straight up the biography of John Harlan.
Favorite song or band?
Grateful Dead. Easy.
Grateful Dead. Easy peasy. Favorite piece of climbing gear?
Chalk bag. No question.
Chalk bag.
I would leave the rope behind before I would leave my chalk bag.
Well, probably more so now when I live on the East Coast than in Colorado, but definitely on the East Coast. All right. Yeah. Gree or ATC?
ATC.
Your favorite car, favorite vehicle?
Oh, I'm on Subaru 8 or 9. I'm a member of the cult.
Subaru 8 or 9. All right. Well, thanks for playing along with that. Just get, people get a different perspective, get to know you kind of quick. I'd like to come back to, I'd heard you use this term polymath, and I think it relates to this whole discussion around diversity and being able to maybe translate or experience, become great or good at different things. And I think there's also crossover lessons from climbing. So I'd love, tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, and maybe I hope this doesn't come across as egotistical. It's not meant to. I consider myself a polymath when I look at my climbing career, my business career, and I'm now into my 40th year as a meditator with another 20 years of yoga and mindfulness in there. And so when I kind of swirl all of that together, I think it comes up with some interesting things. So that make me effective in each area, particularly.
Can you share some crossover or commonalities or?
Well, I think when we really learn to be present, and it's an ongoing lifetime challenge. But how many times are you out with friends climbing and they're stressing about what's happening back at the office, and when they're sitting there at the office, they're daydreaming about they wish they were climbing. If we could actually be present at what we're doing, that I think is a big deal. A lot of clients oftentimes will bring me on to help with interviewing people, because I can, I really know how to show up, and I have a way of both making them attracted to the organization, but also pushing them back on their heels and challenging them. And so it's kind of a dual yin yang kind of thing, but it comes from being very present in the situation. So, there's a business and a climbing kind of application, I think, to that.
So funny you say that. It reminded me of a client call that I had the other day. I was working with an entrepreneur who just had a big disappointment. This big event they were doing just didn't, there were some issues with it. And they were thinking about next year's event, and, they were getting all kind of wrapped up around, they kind of had a strategy for how they were going to react and what they were going to do in the short term, but they were very caught up in all the different things that could or might or should happen between now and next October. And I shared with them something that I've been learning myself with my own coach is clarity. I only have clarity, like, just so far. And my only job is to get more, get there and get more clarity. And it occurred to me, the climbing analogy where, if I look up, I know my intention is to reach the summit. I may or may not, but my intention is to reach the summit. All I have clarity on is like the next 10 feet, right? It's all I have clarity on.
Yeah.
It's all I can see.
It's so amazing you use that word, because I've in my work, and I think it's relevant in climbing, clarity has become sort of a mantra, if you will, because I think it exists in people so little. You're right. You don't have to think about what it's like to be at the top of the climb. You only have to say, can I make it? For me, it's, can I make it to the next piece of gear? Because that's, you can make a decision. Do I go on? Do I come down when you have gear? And so that's always been for me, like, where's my next piece of gear? And that's only how far I have to think. Now, I do have a strategy to go all the way kind of thing, but strategy and clarity of focus are different things. And so I'm only focused on to the next piece of gear.
Yeah, when I coach people through my vertical mind workshops, a lot of times, what's going through people's heads at the bottom is like, oh, I know the crux is really going to be hard. I find it really difficult to do this thing that's like 90 feet up there just before the anchors. Well, that is what we call a distraction. right? And it's in the moment, it's not really helpful. So I've also been coming across clarity as a mantra in my own business and in my own personal life. So those of you out there, I really would encourage you to think about how, what clarity you have in your life, in your business, in your relationships, in your climbing. And I mean, the lesson that I've learned is my job every day is to just get a little more clarity. I mean, it really is almost as simple as that.
I do a lot of writing. It helps bring some clarity to me, because when you get it, when you're in your head, it's not real, but if you put it down on paper and then revisit it over time, it gets real.
So you're actually, I don't know, you're thinking about doing a book, right?
Yes.
And so is that part of the writing that you're talking about? Are you kind of
Yes.
working on that currently?
Well, I'm researching it. I have so much respect for people who have actually written a book as yourself. I don't enjoy writing. I find it painful. And so I hesitate to say I'm writing a book. I'll say I'm researching it.
Researching. If that helps you
about
cope,
100.
if that helps you cope, Ajax, fine. But you're an author in, because you know what, when you're in that spot when you don't like writing, and you just got to embrace the suck and just push through it, because the message that you have is very important. And are you willing to share a little bit about kind of the message?
Sure. It starts in a very dark place, which is, I believe, humanity is right on the cusp. I think decisions we make in the near future will determine what happens to humanity. One group of researchers are saying we have a 20% chance of going extinct as a species by the end of the century, like in 80 years. And I mean, if you went up and someone said there's only an 80% chance you'll survive that climb, would you do it? And a lot of people wouldn't. They'd say that's too risky. Well, that's how humanity's living every day. But there's, short of extinction, we can end up in some bizarre Mad Max dystopian world. And that's probably a 50 to 80% probability. And so, I'm thinking, okay, what do we need to do to save humanity? And I think some of that, and I think it's very apropos to this conversation around climbing, and I think I've alluded to it. I think when we have brain coherence, and what that means is when the different parts of your brain all start functioning as a single unit, and you actually think very differently, and you relate to the world very differently. You're much more tapped into, there's all sorts of terms, collective consciousness, the unified field. But I think the more people that tap into that in a really healthy way, and they don't even need to know they're doing it, that's how we change the world. In my lifetime, 97% of people, of climate scientists are in agreement. So the intellectual approach is not working. We're not saving humanity by the intellectual approach. Ever since I was a little kid, I've seen on TV, the starving children in Biafra, so the emotional approach has not been working. So it's clear there needs to be another path forward. And so my belief is that path forward is through brain coherence, which can come through a number of ways, sort of the big four might be meditation, mindfulness, breath work, yoga, but there's all sorts of other things, time in nature, sports, music. But I think what needs to be part of this is your intention. So in other words, You actually need to let go. That's kind of why when I talk about climbing and being in the flow, it's not about trying, it's about letting go. And so, and your intention does need to be, two people can go on a hike together. One can have tremendous brain coherence from that time in nature and one might not. And I think it's a lot about their intention and how they interact with nature and so forth. But I think through the unified field, people, as that becomes more coherent, humanity will start making choices which will naturally and effortlessly, which will more in line with survival and thriving and all of those sorts of things. So it's not a try. And what's interesting about all of this, to step back a little bit, is, you know, my observation of people in general, they're stressed to the max. They're freaking out on all kinds of level. You know, business today is way more stressful than it ever used to be. If you work in healthcare, not for profit, you're stressed out. So I think what's interesting is the way to save the world starts with radical self-care. If people really start saying, let me take care of myself. I'm going to take time to meditate. I'm going to spend time in nature. I'm going to go climbing and get in the flow. And that radical self-care, I think, will lead to the saving of humanity. Hence why
I love that radical self-care. Right. If you listen to this, write that down. Because, you know, I just was having this conversation with my coach the other day, and I've been saying, you know, you know, Sylvia and I are developing this ranch, and I've got the podcast, and I said, well, I haven't been really going climbing as much as I want. And he said, that's really important to you. You know, you really need to do that, you know? So I love that concept, Ajax, and I want to hear more about that. But if someone, are you, do you have a way for people to stay in touch with what you're doing in this project, or is it so early that they're...
I mean, it's part of my advisory work that I do now, you know, kind of in the business world. I mean, people can reach me. My email is ajax@your.onbelay.com.
I love that. By the way, I love that. I love that URL. I love it. So if you want to stay in touch, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I think it's an important thing. We did kind of a fun photo shoot when I first did my website. It actually needs to be redone. It's gotten very stale, but it was a friend of mine. We went climbing, but he got dressed up in a suit and he had a laptop, but he's leading the climb and he's standing there with this laptop and I'm belaying him. But the idea is, and I think this is important, we don't get through life on our own. I'm a huge believer in community. And so the idea is that you're on belay is a real thing, not just in climbing, but in life, you know, that the people we care about have to feel like they're on belay.
I love that.
That's a really important thing in life.
And you, if you listen to this, you can actually see that photo that Ajax, because I was stalking you, Ajax, overnight. I was stalking. I am the spreadsheet guy, right? I am the preparer. So I was actually stalking Ajax this morning and last night. And yeah, if you go to youronbelay.com, you can see the photo. It's a really cool photo, by the way, and I absolutely love it. And you are the perfect shill, because the next thing I wanted to do was give a plug for one of our other sponsors, which is me. I'm one of our sponsors, and I wanted to share. This is the last book that I wrote to date. And once you write one book, Ajax, you will write more. I guarantee.
Okay.
So this is, I think, my 6th book.
Wow.
There's only 4 good ones, I say, though. The four good books. 2 of them were stinkers. This is actually a good one. It's called The Climb. It's a leadership fable about navigating challenging change, and it uses climbing metaphors, which you were just talking about. Yeah. It's a team that works for a company. They're given a big challenge, then they're totally dysfunctional, and I get to be a character in the book. and kind of through climbing get to show them maybe how to show up differently. So
Yeah.
you can find this on Amazon.com. If you happen to read any book by anybody, actually, leave a review on Amazon. It's really helpful for the author. Not only that, but it also helps other people see. You know, Amazon is great. The more reviews there are, the more they present books to the people they think it might want to read that book. So if you read somebody's book, take the 5 minutes and leave a review on Amazon. It's very helpful for the world. So Ajax, I love that thought of you're on belay and I can think of so many different contexts that could be used in. Mm-hmm. And you currently do consulting, right? Can you share with us kind of how you use that analogy in your consulting?
Well, I described a little bit of my life's purpose now, which is not climbing related, although entirely informed by climbing, is to reinvent the global economy, one person and one company at a time. You know, again, I think if we don't reinvent the global economy, humanity will end up, if not extinct, on some sort of, dystopian, crazy world. So, I'm a really big believer in bringing our values and all of that to our work and being very explicit about it. And I think that's like a really big deal. And I think, I'll go out on a limb and say companies that don't do it will be out of business in 10 years. And I think we're going to see huge radical shifts in our economy in the next 10 years. Huge.
Wow. Fantastic stuff. I'd like to bring it back to climbing, some fun stuff that the listeners might get. So favorite place to climb?
I'd have to say the Gunks, not only because I live here, but of anywhere I've been in the world, it's got the best climbing for an aging climber, because there's 5.4s here that are as classic as many of the 5.10s in Yosemite. So for an aging climber, I have lots of climbs that are high quality that I can do that, aren't 5.10 or above. Which is,
I got to second that. And I cut my teeth in the Gunks, but I haven't been there in quite a while. Till the last few years, I've gone back for some trips. But you can be on a 5.3 and go over a roof, right? I mean, it's
yes.
It's mind-blowingly fun. If you can climb 5.7 or 5.8, you can have a lifetime's worth of climbing in the Gunks. How about favorite place to go to visit and climb, but not necessarily for the climbing? It might be for the food. It might be for the people.
What first comes to mind, and I don't want to belabor it, but I'm not a big gambler, but when I do go to Red Rocks, I'll take one night, go down to the Strip, go out for dinner, then I'll take like $100, which is my budget for the night. I wait in line for the cheapest, $2 or not craps, 21 table, blackjack, and I'll play as long as that $100 lasts. And I just view it as paid entertainment. Like, I'm not expecting to win, and I enjoy it. It's a diverse experience that I don't get very often.
Excellent. How about money saving tip for when you travel? Climbers, love to save money. Anything to share?
Boy, I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask for.
Neither am I, by the way. Neither.
I'm not a good saver. It's never been a real strength of mine. I like, when I travel, I like to eat out. I hate to camp. I guess the best thing I could say is, how many people can you fit in a motel room? Definitely right. Push those limits.
Push those limits, but don't push them too far. You want to stay away from the places. Something like, I went to Winslow, Arizona once, and there was a hotel for $19.95. I was like, I'm not pushing those limits.
Right, there you go.
So how about we talked about diversity. We talked about, being in tune with your body and with your mind. And it's interesting that the things we've talked about for remaining in the game, almost they're very mental. They're very kind of on the spiritual side and on the balance side, not so much about the
Absolutely.
training side. So
Yeah.
anything else to share along those lines?
Um, no, I mean, like for me, when I'm at my fit best, it's like, I'm climbing, biking, yoga, and I just rotate, you know. And so, I'm doing something almost every day, but it's always different. And I don't get injured. I stay in the game. I'm having fun because I enjoy those other activities as much as climbing. So it's not like I feel like I'm, suffering to do these other things. Now, going to the gym, which I do here in the winter, yes, that is, I don't enjoy gym culture, rock gym. I'm not rock gym, I mean regular weightlifting gym. I don't enjoy the culture, but it's good for my body. I'll have to say that you'll like this because of what I do in the gym. My knees are better now in my 60s than they were in my 40s. So, there is hope because at one point my knees were getting so bad, I was getting worried. I got other things that worry me, but now my knees are good.
One thing that I've discovered, and I think this really came out of, I had some lower back problems in my 30s and then, shoulder problems when I was in my early 50s, is that I do like a physical, like 30 to 45 minutes of physical therapy pretty much every morning, like stretching and, stretching the joints that are problematic for me or that I feel that might be problematic. And I agree. Like when I do that, that's a game changer for me. I mean,
it's interesting. I went to the Bonnie Prudence School a long time ago. I'm a certified myotherapist and exercise therapist. I haven't practiced since the mid 80s, but I have that experience. But the one thing that I did before then, but Bonnie only poured gas on it for me, was I warm up before I climb. So I walk to the climb. I have this whole warm up routine that I do, which involves, it's neither stretching or strengthening. It's just taking your joints through their range of motion to get you lightly warmed up. And none of my partners do it. They all laugh at me. They all tease me. But yet I'm not injured, And so I'm a huge, huge, huge believer in warming up. So, I walk, I warm up, I do a warm up pitch if I can, and then, then I climb.
Well, that's super valuable. I truly believe that, and just devoting the time to that maintenance of the joints, right? When I had my shoulder surgery, my doc said a stiff joint is a painful joint. Mm. And, as we get older, our joints will stiffen up unless we do something about it. I would love to hear about, in this last year, what was one of your highlights from a climbing standpoint? Was it a flow day? What was your highlight this past year?
One of the things I've started doing here in the Gunks is trying to see if I can do climbs all in one pitch to the top. And what that means, and these are, we'll say, in the 6 to 8 range for me. But what that oftentimes means is you can't put the gear where you want it, because if you do that, you'll get rope drag and you won't succeed. So you can only put gear where it makes sense. And I've been doing this for a few years, but, for example, doing Madam G's to the top in one pitch. It's not a crazy hard thing, but it's it takes a climb you've done lots of times, adds a new twist and a new challenge to it, keeps it a little bit fresh. And you got to have your head on to do it because, I'm scared, I want a piece of gear, but if I put it in, it'll mess me up. And it might be a bomber piece right there, and you have to skip it to where it makes sense. So it takes like a level of discipline, and so that's kind of a fun game that I've been playing.
And that I think is back to diversity, right? Trying different things, playing the game maybe a little bit differently, right? That requires some different skills. Well, Ajax, I can't tell you what it means to me. I'm so honored to have had you on the first Climbing Lifer podcast. I have had an absolute blast. I think you've shared some incredible information that, you know, the listeners of this, both who are watching it live and who will see it on the podcast, it's going to get their brains tweaked and get their brains thinking. And I really, really appreciate you and what you've shared with us today.
Well, it was a gas and it was fun. And, you know, to future folks, you know, it'll be fun. So jump on and have fun with it.
All right. Thank you so very much, Ajax. And again, this is the Climbing Lifer podcast. This is episode number 1. It'll be published out on iTunes when I get to it. It might be within a week or two. But again, I want to honor Ajax for joining, and thanks everyone who tuned in. Thank you for being part of the Climbing Lifer community.